Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel. My name is Melody Gracia, NXT team member at Nexus Marketing, and your moderator for today's panel. Today's panel topic is financial transparency and accountability in nonprofits, best practices, and compliance. And as usual, before I introduce today's panelists and we jump into this fascinating topic, I do have some quick logistics to cover. NX Unite by Nexus Marketing serves as a powerful community resource designed to foster connections and facilitate lasting relationships within the mission-driven sector. On NX Unite, you can find upcoming industry events, suggested influencers to follow, trusted solutions, and cost-driven podcasts. NX Unite also hosts webinars, demos, and of course, panels with experts such as these lovely folks with me here today. Today's hour-long panel will include time both for questions curated by my team and questions from you all, our fantastic audience. So at any time during the panel, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them during the second half of the session. Finally, before I introduce today's panelists, I want to thank you all for attending this panel. We're very excited to be in touch with you, the mission-driven community. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today to learn from these outstanding experts who will now finally introduce. I'd like to first introduce Chris Bavalak, who is the Director of Finance and Operations at Chazin and Company. Although accounting is their business, nonprofits are their passion. This passion, coupled with years of practical experience, has made them premier provider of outsourced accounting and finance solutions for the nonprofit sector. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Also with us is Elizabeth Manchester, who is a partner and chair of Nonprofit and Charitable Organizations Group at Partridge, Snow and Han. She's an attorney counseling charitable and nonprofit organizations on compliance, formation, charitable gift planning, gifts of complex assets, and deferred giving programs. Elizabeth, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Also with us today is Karen Houghton, who is the CEO and founder at Infinite Giving. She leverages her deep nonprofit expertise to bring modern cash management to nonprofit organizations all over the U.S. She advocates for organizational sustainability through better financial management, strategic access to curated investment practices, and increased stock, crypto, and DAF giving. Karen, thanks for joining.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me.
And finally with us is Marilyn Foster Kirk, who is the Executive Vice President at TWB Fundraising. She's a collaborative, client-focused professional with more than 40 years experience as a major gift officer, fundraising executive, consultant, and educator. Marilyn, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Hello to everyone who's here on the website today.
All right, well, it's now finally time to hear from our panelists. And Chris, I'll have you start us off with the first question. Why is transparency important for nonprofits, and what are some key elements of financial transparency and accountability that nonprofits need to uphold?
Wow. Okay. So first importance, and I think some of the other panelists would agree, it's just really important for nonprofits to build credibility and trust with their stakeholders, whether that's donors, members, board members, staff, people who use their services. It's transparency is a way to build that credibility and trust. As far, I could go on for a long time on different things you can do. So on the second part of the question, and I also want to add something else. Actually, forgot this. I think transparency is incredibly important for the nonprofit sector as a whole. In other words, the whole sector needs to build its credibility and its trust. So that then applies, beyond your normal stakeholders to legislators and the people who, make the laws and the rules in this country. And we want to have the nonprofit sector to be a trusted entity that people can support and all the good work that's being done. Tell me again what the second part of that question was.
Absolutely. The second part, what are some key elements of financial transparency and accountability that nonprofits need to uphold?
So when we talk about accountability and we talk about transparency, from my world, the accounting world, they can be quite separate and quite different. And so when we talk about compliance and accountability, that depends so much on the type of organization you are, the size of organization you are, where you are, how you get your funds. There can be local compliance, state compliance, federal compliance. Then there's generally accepted accounting principles, and there's FASB, and your auditors have certain compliance requirements, and your funders have certain compliance requirements. So I can't just say do A, B, C, and D, and everybody is compliant, or everybody is accountable. So it kind of depends. From a transparent perspective, I think the more you can begin to share information, you can work on your transparency, and there's different levels of that. What I was going to say, it's, I believe strongly in a culture of transparency, which I'm not going to get into right now because I could go for like 15 minutes on that alone. But it's really important, I believe, for an organization to be truly transparent, to develop a culture of transparency that starts internally, moves up into their board, and then publicly.
Wonderful. Thanks for starting us off, Chris. All right, Karen, over to you. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And when you look at a data point, I believe a study by GuideStar showed that 80% of donors said that transparency about the use of funds is crucial in their decision to support a nonprofit. So we know right there, if 80% of our donor base is saying this is crucial, then that's clearly an important aspect of having transparency. The bigger question is how do you get that transparency, right? If you're looking to foster that with donors, beneficiaries, and the public, as Chris alluded to, there are different ways of doing that with different stakeholders. And so I think the two biggest takeaways at a high level is understanding that you have to have knowledge and open communication in order to have that earned trust, right? If you're looking at stewardship, that's going to require clarity and data points to ensure you're doing the best practices. And then you have to clearly communicate those to the appropriate stakeholders. A very anecdotal kind of story about understanding your own finances and kind of where you're sitting is understanding, hey, what are the fee structures that you're paying, right? Whether that's, I'm an investment advisor who works with nonprofits. So we often have those conversations and they're like, oh, no worries. I'm with the community foundation. It's wonderful. We're only paying, 40 bips per, we're only paying 40 bips. And I'm like, let's take a look, right? And so we'll go down that path. And they actually, with best of intentions, don't understand that they're actually paying 40 bips per quarter, right? Versus an annual rate. And so then on any investments that they're sitting in, okay, well, then if you're doing 40 times 4, right? So then they're paying, that 1.6%, right? And then you also have advisory fees on top of that. So sometimes when we're just doing audits of hey, where are your funds sitting? What are they making? In order to be transparent about that, you have to have that knowledge. So really understanding, oh, we should go do a deep dive into this. Okay, we're actually paying 3% in advisory fees over here. Yes, we have a sweep program, but maybe we're only making 1.5%, but over in this account, we could make 4%. So I think making sure you have a lot of due diligence and candid knowledge about what it is that you're managing, and then being able to communicate that to the right folks in a way that ensures you're always stewarding your funds with that responsibility of ensuring you have the organization's best interests at the forefront.
Thanks for sharing, Karen. All right, Marilyn, over to you. Why is transparency so important, and what are some key elements to uphold?
Well, I think some really good points that both Karen and Chris are making is about, who are your stakeholders and how well do you know them? And I think sometimes when we talk about transparency and accountability, we're thinking that that is understood in the same way by everyone who's associated with your organization. And that's not necessarily true. So the key, which is, a key to good fundraising, is to know your donors. And I think the same is true in talking about transparency and accountability. Know your donors, know your other stakeholders, and what kind of information they want. So there will be some donors who will want, a lot of what I would call quantitative detail about different kinds of things. Karen was talking about investments. There will be some donors, let's say they've given you an endowed fund. They know it's invested. They're going to want to know, how is it performing financially? There are other donors or other stakeholders who are going to say, so how are you using my money and what difference is it making? What kind of impact are you having? And how are we moving ahead with our contributions toward achieving the mission of our organization? So those are equally important pieces of information that donors or other stakeholders might ask, and it's all a part of transparency and accountability. So, my takeaway is don't think about every donor or every stakeholder group as being just like the others. They all have different needs and interests. More particularly as you're able, know as many of your donors and stakeholders on a personal level so that you can give them the information that they want. So this is a communication. It's not just about the information the organization wants to share with these folks. It's about getting the information to stakeholders that they want to know.
Wonderful. Thanks, Marilyn. All right, Elizabeth, final thoughts on the importance of transparency and some crucial elements to uphold.
Yeah, I'm going to echo the sentiments that have already been expressed. Obviously, financial transparency is extremely important to the success of nonprofits. I think we're seeing a real key moment in what's been going on in college and university campuses with an outcry for financial transparency in a way that has been made boards and key stakeholders at universities think really critically about how they're sharing transparency regarding their endowment and investment assets. But being an attorney, a lot of what I coach organizations on and help them with are regulatory aspects for financial transparency. And I think Chris alluded to it. There's a lot both on the federal and state level, depending on where you sit and where you operate. Federal transparency, as we all know, tax-exempt organizations are beholden to the IRS. So there are certain public disclosure requirements the IRS mandates at a very basic level for many types of tax-exempt organizations. And increasingly in this ever more rigorous regulatory society that we are in for tax-exempt organizations, states have clear rules, and many of them about financial transparency mandates for nonprofit organizations. And I think a lot of it starts with internal controls and the board. Really the buck stops with the board if something goes sideways. And so I think it's really important for organizations to have really great corporate governance in place and to constantly be reviewing their policies and procedures with regard to corporate governance and how it relates to their financial transparency. Whether you're a board-led organization or a larger organization that might have staff that's assisting you with many different levels of financial transparency, to me, the internal controls are very important.
Elizabeth. All right, we're off to a great start. And Marilyn, I'll have you start us off with the next question. What strategies can nonprofits implement to enhance trust and become more transparent as an organization?
Well, I think, we can start with kind of where we left off with this discussion. I think, first of all, it starts with the board and it ends with the board. Elizabeth mentioned, basically the buck stops at the board meeting room, but I think it starts in the board meeting room as well. And that means, first of all, that the board members need to understand what the particular regulatory requirements are, what their role is. They serve as fiduciaries. What does that mean? It's a legal term. It has a legal definition. but it also has, I think, a connotation about ensuring the best interests of the organization. So if members of the board and the executive that they hire start out with the idea that our job is always to protect the organization that we're a part of, then you start thinking about what are the things that need to be in place, what are the strategies that build trust. And certainly, there are certain kind of basic considerations. I think transparency and accountability are values that are both defined by ethical behavior and legal compliance. So there's the ethical side of this responsibility. Having policies in place, not just policies with regard to how do you record and invest and report funds that you've received, but the strategies are also important up front, that when you ask people to make contributions to your organizations, you need to be telling the truth in your solicitation. So what is the money going to be used for? What is the organization intending to do with it? How are we going to measure what kind of impact it has? So thinking through those kinds of considerations as you put the message together to solicit donors in the first place is one of the strategies. Certainly, if you're going to government entities for grant support, take the time to do the due diligence to understand what the requirements are of those organizations, foundations, as well as governmental groups. Make sure that you are willing to comply with the expectations that are always clearly set out, particularly with the government organizations. And that once you accept a gift or a grant from those organizations, you're going to comply with the timelines that are set for reporting and the other kinds of things. So I think it starts with that mindset. I think, another strategy, once again, comes back to understanding who your audiences are, knowing what they want to know, and throughout your organization, informing staff what their responsibilities are to help you achieve that transparency and accuracy. So, for example, not so much that it happens this way anymore, but at one time, if someone were going to call a nonprofit, let's say, for information, they would normally reach an office number with an individual whose primary responsibility was to answer the phone and do some other kinds of things. Somebody called and said, "Can I get a copy of your 990 form?" That particular individual needs to be informed to know that that is an obligation of a nonprofit organization and to whom that kind of request should be directed. So informing folks inside the organization is another important strategy to make sure that we're being transparent and accurate. I think there's there are a number of different strategies about understanding the relationship between what a donor expects, for example, and what an organization expects. And unfortunately, I've seen situations in my career where donors thought they had communicated to the organization what they wanted their money to do, and organizations thought they understood. But when it came down to actually using the money, there was a difference of opinion. And I think this, again, is a strategy is saying, before you accept a gift as a nonprofit organization or ask for a gift, make sure that you've really had a thorough conversation with the donor. Make sure that you can talk through what all the expectations are, and then put that expectation into writing, and then make sure that everybody in the organization that may ever have need to know has that information available to them. So setting expectations up front about how funds are to be used. The other side of that, then, of course, is making sure that funds are actually used the way they've been accepted.
Such great points. Thanks, Marilyn. All right, Elizabeth, over to you. Any tips on how to enhance trust and become more transparent as an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think Marilyn alluded to a lot of them. Just to pick up on one of the things she mentioned about being very transparent in, your donor conversations and memorializing gift conversations appropriately, because obviously restricted funds and the use of them is very important to nonprofit organizations. What I see a lot in my practice is for even very mature organizations, sometimes very poor record keeping practices, or very, I would say they're not really gift agreements. They're relying on things like a couple of sentences and an email for sometimes very large and significant gifts. And obviously things change in terms of the mission and space of a nonprofit. And then maybe 50 years later, we're looking back at the documentation and use of that gift and are now thinking about filing a cypre petition or something like that in a court to remove the restriction on the gift. But unfortunately, we have very poor historic record keeping about, how that gift was even documented in the first place. So what I would just encourage organizations to do is develop policies, as to how they're having gift acceptance conversations, how they're having gift agreements drafted and formulated, obviously making sure you're following through on your policies, because if you're not utilizing your policies appropriately, they're just a piece of paper that's just going to die on the vine. But I think that's a really important thing to just be constantly transparent in your conversation with donors, but obviously making sure you're memorializing those conversations appropriately in a way that if a third party asks someday, or someone you're stewarding the fund for asks about the use of the fund, you can, produce that document if you want to.
Thanks, Elizabeth. All right, Chris, over to you. Thoughts on how to enhance trust and become more transparent as an organization?
Yeah, I think this does give me an opportunity to talk about culture a little bit more, and everybody has hit on the major points one way or the other. And when you're developing a culture of transparency within your organization, it starts with the systems that you have that are set up properly to track data and to make sure you can provide information that's meaningful to people. Marilyn, you mentioned, showing effectiveness, or maybe it's you want to show how much money is raised per every dollar spent on fundraising, or whatever it needs to be. But you have to have systems that are well set up to track the data and then report on the data, which leads to, Elizabeth, you were talking about processes and policies. And yes, you have to, if you're going to remain compliant, if you're going to handle funds the way you're supposed to, you need to have processes that help you do that, and to meet all those different types of compliance areas that I mentioned earlier. And then it starts with, and I think someone sort of alluded to this, how are you transparent internally with your own staff? Does the staff have information on how the organization is doing? Can they participate in the success of the organization, or is that very closely held? And then to the board, which again, it has been mentioned, we've worked with many organizations where the board doesn't get the information that they should be getting. So yes, they're the end game. They're fiduciarily responsible for the organization, but if they don't know what's going on, they can't behave in that way. They can't fulfill their responsibility. And so really what needs to happen is everybody needs to decide, that they want to be transparent and at what level, and they need to have that conversation. So a CEO or an executive director should have this conversation during a board meeting with their board, and they should decide, well, one, we agree, it's important, we want to be transparent, and how can we do that, and how should we do that, and then commit to it. So that, I would say that's sort of the high level strategy to work towards becoming transparent from the beginning.
Thanks, Chris. All right, Karen, over to you. What would you like to add here?
Yeah, I love the culture of transparency. And we were talking about ensuring, like, essentially having fiduciary partners and systems to honor those donor wishes. I always love to come back to knowledge, because there's such a variable, right? And in nonprofit leadership and who you have doing your bookkeeping and finances, sometimes it's part-time volunteers, sometimes you have an entire team. And I think having that knowledge to kind of know what those donors have and having a system to follow that is so often where kind of it goes off the rails. I know I was talking to an organization the other day, and they had an endowment. These were their words. They were like, yes, we have an endowment. A donor gave us, it was like $500,000 to steward well. And if we stewarded it well, then 2 years from now, they would give them another $500,000. And they wanted our help. And I was like, great, well, we're over a year in, where's that been sitting? And they're like, it was in a checking account making like less than 1%. And I was like, that's not an endowment. But the board was really torn because they didn't want to take on risk, right? And then they didn't have the right fiduciary partners in place to be able to say, okay, we want to reduce our risk because we want to show performance and stewardship. There are absolutely more alternatives than what they chose to do. And so now they're trying to backtrack to be like, oh, we made a mistake. Can we still try to change our practices? Having policies in place, like an investment policy statement or a cash management policy or an endowment agreement, and we make those all day long every day, but having those is what kind of starts to give your organization the guardrail, the education, the knowledge, and the tools to be able to say, okay, if we have funds of this kind, here's where we do this, and this is what the donor would like. So knowledge and communication, and I think always the less sexy stuff, but like ethical governance, right? I know this is Elizabeth's stuff, so you're better to speak into this, but adherence to all this compliance and the codes of conduct and conflict of interest. I'm on the board of trustees for higher ed. And like the first thing we did is we updated our conflict of interest and disclosure forms before we even got into that meeting. That's something that's easy to forget to do, but it's so important. And so I think as we think about the open communication, making sure we have the knowledge and the policies in place is really key to enhance that trust and transparency.
And Karen, just to piggyback off that, I find, and I'm sure you might encounter this being an investment expert, a lot of the times boards might have an investment account that they're calling an endowment, but it's really not even a true endowment. So there's so much education, I think, from a technical space, and it's nice to have a team of advisors around you, and it's why I think it is so important. And the other thing, just to pick up on the ethical point, you know, when I first started practicing, I think a lot of boards just checked off, like we have our conflict of interest policy, we have our bylaws, but there are so many policies now. It's like a suite of policies that an organization should maintain. I mean, just now with things like cyber attacks and cybersecurity policies and privacy policies, and there's so many things that an organization really has to maintain its good ethical status. But I think it all sort of flows up to financial transparency at the end of the day. So just to really make sure organizations are holistically thinking about all of those things.
Yeah, and even like when the term endowment, to your point, like that, there's a lot of terminology that's thrown around in nonprofit finance that can have multiple kind of applications. And so even understanding endowment, I was like, that's not, what do you describe as an endowment? Like, how are you defining that? And then let's talk about kind of standards in that. Is it a quasi, restricted, true, term? Like there's all these different ways to do that. So yes, I think defining that and having those policies and sometimes having those strategic partners in place, like you don't have to recreate the wheel every time. You can find somebody because you're probably managing a million things. Maybe you're a volunteer. Maybe you're drowning doing 5 people's jobs because you work for a nonprofit, right? So really understanding the time and place to bring in an expert like any of the folks on this call, I think is a tool and a very strategic tool to say, all right, Tag, you come in, help us understand this better, because we're all serving nonprofits as for-profit, right? We're all for-profit here, but we're serving nonprofits out of a mission, right? This is typically a calling. For me, it is very much a calling. I've been an executive director of a nonprofit. I've been the fundraiser. I serve on boards. So having that understanding, usually people in this space are here to serve you well.
Yeah, and maybe Chris, excuse me.
No,
Chris may be the best person to respond to this, but when you were talking, Karen, about boards not necessarily understanding endowments, what they are, what the types are that we speak about, I also find that board members oftentimes do not understand fund accounting, which is the principal accounting process in nonprofits. And many of our board members will come from the for-profit world. Obviously, there's similarities, but there are differences. Mm-hmm. And I think a good practice is to make sure that there's always a board education process, that not just when a new member joins, but repeatedly. I found on a number of boards I serve on, you have to keep helping people understand, now, how do I read the balance sheet? And understanding that if they don't understand the financial reports that they're being received, they cannot execute their oversight responsibilities as a board.
Yeah, you kind of anticipated what I was going to jump on, because it's not a matter of how the board interprets whether it's an endowment. It's what do the documents say? Because, when we serve clients, we read the documents, we see what they say, and then we tell them, is this restricted? Is this unrestricted? Is this endowment? Is these board designated? And then things like, is this a grant? Is this a donation? Is this a pledge? That's what we do. And so you kind of maybe saw me waving my finger a little bit when someone talked about volunteer bookkeepers and all that. And I think that's where, and I understand small nonprofits and limits on resources and all that, but there also kind of needs to be an investment in good and high integrity data, because that's what helps you get to compliance, accountability, and transparency. And so it's really important to be working with someone who knows what the rules are and what rules need to be followed and how. So whether it's an internal person or you're working with someone externally, you should have someone that knows the compliance requirements, how to follow them, the processes that are needed, how to properly record the types of resources you're bringing into the organization, and make sure you're doing it right from the very start. Because I tell you, it becomes, if it's found out 5 years later, it's a real mess to untangle and everything. So, you need to look at it as an investment in getting more resources. Again, better trust, better credibility will help bring more resources in the door later on. And that comes from high integrity data and books and all that.
And no one's an expert at everything, right? It's like, it's so much, we feel a responsibility to know all the things, and we have to be good stewards. This is all important work, but you can't know everything. And so that's why it's really good to have partners, Chris, like, and Marilyn, you were saying, in which you can go deep. We have a chat on our website on infiniteGiving.com, and people will have nonprofit leaders just ask questions all the time. And sometimes, it's really basic stuff, but people are asking it. And these are finance folks of like, do we have to pay? Can we even invest? Can we purchase treasury bills? Okay, well, you guys are purchasing treasury. Like, we have a ton of people in treasuries, short-term treasuries right now. But it's like, what does that look like on the books, right? It's cash holdings, it's cash, but also it's in T-bills. And then it's actually, you're not accruing daily interest. How do you book that? So there's all these different variables in the stewardship of it, in the bookkeeping of it. And so they're good questions to ask. It's always good to seek that knowledge, because then you're empowered to steward that better. And then when you can then increase that transparency across the board and create that culture that Chris is talking about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. Very quickly, I'd also like to remind our live audience to start submitting your questions at any time so we can address the topics that are relevant to you and your team. All right, here's our next question. And Elizabeth, I'll have you start us off with this one. What are some common pitfalls nonprofits encounter when striving for financial transparency, and how can they mitigate these risks to maintain accountability?
So pitfalls I see, honestly, sometimes it's surprising. They're quite extreme. For example, I am dealing with a couple of clients right now that have lost their tax exempt status for failure to file their 990s. Which if you do for longer than 3 years, your status is automatically revoked. So sometimes I think we're thinking through, obviously you need to have all these pieces in place, but the basics are extremely important, and the failure to maintain the basics can have devastating effects on organizations. For example, one of them is about to lose significant grant funding, and we're hustling to try to file their application to reinstate their tax exempt status. So it is often surprising to me how sometimes boards just are missing these very major and basic things, in my mind, to fulfill financial transparency mechanisms, and sometimes can have quite detrimental effects. The other thing I've noticed lately, just as a trend, is donors are increasingly vigilant, and sometimes unreasonably so. I feel like organizations are maintaining a certain level of financial transparency, but a failure to submit an annual report on the date they would normally receive an annual report is leading donors to, for example, ask for the return of a gift, which is completely unreasonable in my mind. But I've just noticed this as a trend. So the reality is we can all be maintaining good financial transparency, but a bad PR result can be even more detrimental. So I think we just have to be increasingly vigilant and maintain all those good policies and practices. And I think a good mechanism to maintain financial transparency, even if you aren't required to get an audit done every year. An audit is a very good check and balance, an external audit, to make sort of a gut check if you are, if everything is kosher within the organization, to eliminate any threat of fraud. I think you may, of course, be mandated by statute or by virtue of federal funding to complete audit or audited financial statements every year, depending on what state you're operating in. But I do think audits are a very good investment for board members to look to do every year to avoid a terrible result, a fraudulent result, which I have seen happen within organizations, but just as a good gut check in terms of their internal procedures and if it's complying in the most substantial way.
Elizabeth, Marilyn, any common pitfalls you've seen and how to avoid them?
Well, I think there was a very good point made about, I think today's donors are much more, I'm going to say activist than they have been. Certainly over the span of my career, that's been a dramatic change. Some of my first contacts with donors remind me that there was a sort of unquestionable kind of trust with nonprofits. People would give you money and say, I know that whoever the executive director or president is will use it in the way it's supposed to be used and where it's needed most. Very few of our donors today respond that way, and some are more activist than others. I think that, that's part of the transparency question too, is to make sure that the organization understands how it's supposed to use money and then uses it as they have agreed to use it. Sometimes organizations will, let's say, seek to raise money for a specified purpose. They exceed the goal or the established amount that they were looking to raise. And rather than being honest with the donors and saying, we have now exceeded our goal, we don't need the money for this project, is it acceptable to use the, let's say, excess amount that we've raised for these other projects? They just assume they can go ahead and use the money that way. And when a donor finds out, which, who knows when they will or won't, that the organization has functioned in that way, you lose an enormous amount of trust. So I think that the total honesty with donors is extremely important. We often talk, I think, about placing an emphasis on how the money was used, the outcomes, and the impact that the money has made possible. Sometimes the money doesn't have the impact that you've talked about. And rather than trying to gloss that over, I think you have to be honest with donors. Again, if we built relationships with donors, not just gone after transactions to get money, we can talk with a donor and let them know why we are not achieving the impact we thought we were going to achieve. So I think being able to deliver the bad news is something we need to think about. Have we created relationships with our various stakeholders so that if the time comes that we have to deliver something that isn't necessarily positive to them, that we can do that and we will do that. That builds trust for the future when we are honest with the folks that we deal with.
Yeah. I'd kind of like to add to that because it's going along the same line. And I kind of looked at this question a little bit differently, and that a lot of the pitfalls I see that nonprofit leaders have is convincing everybody or convincing the board that, yeah, we need to be transparent and it's okay to be transparent. And this is good for us in the long run. And then the second sort of maybe bump in the road is having the information, the good information that they need to be able to be transparent and being confident in that information. But to Marilyn's point, you're not committed to transparency if you only post information when it's good, right? And we've all had some tough years, the last 4 years. And I think there's a real opportunity for organizations that when they have a challenging year to post information that addresses those challenges and talks about how they're addressing those challenges, how they're going to make it through this tough time and everything, because it shows good leadership. It shows solid practices in place and everything. And so nonprofits shouldn't be afraid to post next year's financials and have them be a little bit down. Instead, they should include some narrative or include some information that says, hey, yeah, we're a little bit down this year, but this is what we're doing to turn it back the other way. And we're looking good, because to Marilyn's point, I think donors like, genuine and trustworthy organizations to work with. And that's what you're being genuine if you're attacking the good and the bad as it goes.
Yeah, Chris, and if I could just add to that, I think that also an important part of financial transparency for organizations is knowing when they need to really think about dissolving or merging, because what I've seen as well is organizations wait too long in those bad years. And it did certainly happen, as you mentioned, during COVID and the pandemic, where a lot of organizations were hit so hard from a financial point of view, they just couldn't sustain themselves, but perhaps waited a bit too long to think about merging or dissolving, or actually are faced with some bankruptcy issues now. So I think it's a good practice for boards to critically just be looking at that, not just when the bad times hit, but if they're on sort of a downward trend, to start really critically thinking about what's financially responsible for them and the funds that they have as an organization, and to think about alternatives, merging or dissolving in some cases.
Yeah, which also goes back to sort of just because having good data and having the boards look at good data, because if they can't see the projections, if they're not seeing where the organization is going, then you're right, they don't make the right decisions. So again, that's having partners that can help you understand exactly what's going on. So, and
not only is it good data, it's data that they can read and understand, right? Yes. I think sometimes like board members have best of intentions, but if you're putting in front of them these complex spreadsheets, and you're like, this is transparent, I'm giving you all the knowledge. If they don't understand that and have context. So I think it's you understand that knowledge, but then you've got to present it in a way that's digestible, that you can understand. And then if they want to dig in and you can be like, great, yes, I have sources, I can show all of that, but making sure, I think too often you have investment advisors who will come in and annually and do the big, like, here's this full big report and the dog and pony show. But then nonprofit leaders are sitting there going, I don't really understand how that's applicable to me and to us. And like, I heard the market, but I need them to connect that information. Right. And I think like the audit is really important. Like when we're talking about audits, and when we were preparing for this, I saw a study that said the Stanford Social Innovation Review reported that nonprofits spend an average of close to 4% on their budget in auditing to ensure financial integrity. Now, again, you're looking at a big variable of nonprofits, but like that's not administrative costs. That's not overhead costs. That's like a lot of these organizations are intentionally putting budget aside to ensure that financial integrity. So I think there's a couple ways we can do audits. Yes, it's that kind of formal, and we help with audit support for our organizations. We provide all the documentation they need, but also that internal audit of like, okay, where are our funds? Where are they sitting? Do we need 6 bank accounts for FDIC coverage? Can we just get an FDIC sweep program? The answer is you don't need more than like 2 accounts. You should be in an FDIC sweep program. Streamline all of that bookkeeping. Or if it is somewhere, what are you paying in fees? What are those yields? How are you getting these reports? And are you able to communicate it in an easy way? There's just so often we don't do that. And then you may even be somebody who I would say, one of the biggest pitfalls is that you're operating in a scarcity mindset, which we all start there, right? That's where everybody starts. That's okay. But it's like you have to start moving into an abundance mindset when you want to start really having financial integrity, because you have to start pulling in some experts. You also have to start building a reserve fund, right? Those who had healthy reserve funds, the odds were much greater in their favor to survive those hard years than those who are living, and surviving month to month with like 1 or 2 months in their reserves. So sometimes we'll even get into the weeds in the beginning of saying, great, pre-COVID, it was 3 to 6 months of operational reserves. Post-COVID, it's 6 to 12 months of operational reserves put aside. And it's not just excess funds. It's clearly demarked like, hey, and there's no wrong answer between 6 to 12, right? Every organization is different. So say you want 6 months of operational reserve funds, those should be separated out. Those should be put in a low risk, high liquidity holding. That should be clearly communicated to the board so that when it's there and any donors or board members ask, you're like, yes, as part of our, fiduciary responsibility and good stewardship, we want to ensure that we always have 6 months of operational reserves on hand. Even like we do a lot of building funds and capital campaigns and help folks with those. And then it's, well, where are those sitting while you're fundraising? And then also when you're fundraising, you already built up capital reserves because you're going to build the building and then you're going to need a new roof. You're going to have a leak. There's going to be a plumbing problem, an HVAC issue. So it's like, are you also thinking about having reserve funds there? So I think whether you're in that abundance mindset and you're able to plan more in the future, or you are still in the scarcity mindset and getting there, ensuring that you're really emphasizing that stewardship of that knowledge and that clear communication to that board so that they can understand and come alongside you in that.
And Karen, I think you alluded to a very important point, which is that there is a great value in having someone who is an external objective, I'm going to say expert, whether that's an audit firm or whether it's someone else that comes in and takes a look at what you're doing. And I'm thinking particularly about sometimes with smaller nonprofit organizations, we create this talent matrix. What are we looking for in terms of board members? So we need an attorney, we need an accountant, we need a banker, assuming that they will be able to provide the kind of expertise that the organization needs at no cost. And in the best of all possible circumstances, that is true, except it's not sufficient. Because someone who is on the board has a vested interest. They're no longer objective about looking at the information in the strictest sense of that word. So you can get good advice from volunteers who serve on a board with expertise, but when you want an opinion that is objective and independent, you really have to be prepared to go outside the organization for that.
Yes, and they're volunteers. So they're doing full-time other jobs, and then you're wanting them to do there. And then there's often a conflict of interest, and then you have to do proper disclosures. And then what if they don't do a good job? Who's double checking that that board member is doing what they need to do, but they're your expert? And so there's not that overlaying of, do you have, unbiased eyes doing that? If they fail to do that job, are you kicking them off the board? Like, that doesn't always work that way. And so, yeah, Marilyn, 100% agree ideally the board's job is not to do that work, but to oversee and ensure that whoever is doing that work is doing it accordingly to the policies and the guidance of the organization. The DIYing it we hear disaster stories quite often from that, and it's the best of intentions, but it's not the best practices.
Thanks for sharing, Marilyn and Karen. All right, here's our next question. And Karen, I'll stick with you for this question. What tools or solutions can help improve financial accountability and reporting for nonprofits?
Oh, there's so many good things. And I know it's like with tech, there's which platform, which one do we want to use? There's tons of utilizing cloud-based accounting software. You want to have really good CRM tracking. I think, please don't be in Excel sheets for, your tracking. We all use Excel, but like I've seen where they're actually creating their P&L and doing it line by line in Excel sheets. And so I think when we're talking about creating these systems to improve those, it's like, hey, what software is out there? What partners can you have to streamline that and make your life a bit easier? We have a platform where you can have how you raise money, how you're managing your cash, how you're creating endowments and dispersing that, all of that in one place that just links to your bank account. So you can move money back and forth as needed, but otherwise all that kind of financial side of things is in one. And then you can just integrate like with your QuickBooks or whatever, versus alternative is like, oh, you have a brokerage account over here. You have 4 or 5 bank accounts, you have some holdings here. So that I think when you take a moment and you step back and you may have always done it a certain way, there sometimes is better ways and better partners or newer kind of innovative platforms that can help bring that transparency. I know in ours, we do a lot of endowment creation and management and policy creation around that. And we actually have a donor portal to where a donor can log in and view their endowment. And they get thanked and they get to see their name in there. We usually do it for named endowments. And then we actually provide their annual reporting for them. And then they can actually add cash and stock gifts directly into their endowment. So there's some really cool, unique things that are coming out with innovation, with the idea of providing you tools to make that transparency easier, especially with brokerage accounts. Don't do the random one-off brokerage accounts that people lose the login. You don't know what's sitting in there because no one's checked it, right? I think there's multiple users. Instead of the 4 to 6 week process, even our brokerage account opening fully digital, we can have a brokerage account open for you with 20 minutes of your time and 2 to 3 business days on our end. So instead of being like, oh, it's something new, I know it's one more thing, but having that open mind and exploring like, hey, could there be a better way? Most folks have the goal of making your life easier, not harder.
Karen, Chris, any tools or solutions you recommend?
Well, I will tag on to that. I mean, from an accounting perspective, particularly nonprofit accounting perspective, having the right systems in place to track the data. But what's more importantly is making sure the system is set up properly to do what you need it to do. And the people operating the systems know what they're doing so that the right information is getting in there. We all know the garbage in, garbage out phrase. And if so the data has to be put in correctly. And then those people also need to know the processes and that you need to have in place to be compliant as well and meet best practices. So I think those, that's the fundamentals, I'd say.
Thanks, Chris. All right, Marilyn and Elizabeth, anything else you want to add here? Otherwise, we'll move on to our next question. Yes, Marilyn?
I just wanted to speak to sort of the providing a tool to the board of trustees or board of directors about compliance. Putting together what I call a schedule of all of the compliance requirements. So, what is it necessary? What's necessary to be completed, and what is the date by which it needs to be done? So, if we charge boards with responsibility for oversight, if you don't know what is necessary in terms of meeting compliance, it's hard to provide oversight. So having this list ahead of time that maybe needs to be prepared with outside experts as well as internal administrative staff of saying, okay, so these reports are due at a certain time. Which of these require board review and approval? Which of these do not require board oversight and approval, but need to be submitted on a timely basis? So providing that kind of tool to a board so they can be responsible for their oversight, I think is very important.
I think just the only thing I would add is, just to make sure within your bylaws or your committee descriptions, I mean, all the things Marilyn just mentioned, that you actually have put pen to paper about who is responsible for overseeing all these systems, how they'll be evaluated annually, every 3 years will you go out to bid, just making sure that board members or committee members, if they're non-board members, understand their role with regard to the oversight and just don't assume.
Well, thanks, Elizabeth. All right. Unbelievably, the hour has gone by so quickly, so we're going to wrap up this portion of the panel so we can stick to our schedule. Now, if you have questions for our panelists, please complete the survey that's dropped in the chat to indicate which panelists you have questions for, and we'll make sure to connect you with them after the session. I've had such a wonderful time hearing from our panelists today, and I'm hoping to get one final piece of insight from them all. And Chris, I'll have you start us off with this question. What is the future of financial transparency and accountability for nonprofits, and how can nonprofits get ahead today?
Yeah, I hope the future is is very good in that nonprofits see the importance in transparency and work to become more and more transparent. It's it's a big package there, and you don't have to do it all at once, but take it kind of step by step. There's lots of opportunities out there. I mean, if you're doing, assuming that your records are good and you're compliant in the way you need to be, and if you have nothing posted and all you do is post your 990, you're a step more transparent than you were yesterday. Now, going back to what somebody said earlier, not everybody can read a 990 or get the right information out of it, but there are some wonderful opportunities within the 990 to sell your organization. So I say use those if you have audited financial statements. So I would say, get going have that discussion with your leadership. Talk about the importance and the commitment to transparency and what next steps might be, and engage the appropriate partners as needed to make that happen.
Chris. Elizabeth, over to you. What is the future of financial transparency and accountability for nonprofits?
I think the future is that nonprofits will continue to face pressures to be increasingly transparent, but I do think they should evaluate it and do it in an appropriate manner, make sure they're disclosing to their stakeholders and making themselves attractive to funders, and obviously complying with everything that's mandated from a state and federal regulatory point of view. But I think they should do it in an even-handed manner that will make them sufficiently transparent. I don't think they need to feel that they need to, for example, disclose all of their endowment investments to the general public if they don't have a genuine relationship with that organization in some way. So I think it's not an easy issue, but I think certainly there's pressure to be transparent, but I think a good board will evaluate the best way to do that in a reasonable manner.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Karen, over to you. What is the future and how to get ahead today?
Yeah, I think all this can be overwhelming sometimes. So even just picking like, hey, what are 2 or 3 things that we can do? Like, is it posting a 990? Is it, hey, let's just do a quick internal audit of where things are and what they're doing? Or what's one thing that we can do to improve in how we communicate? So finding those 1 or 2 things. But I think ultimately we're all sitting here saying, yes, transparency is important. Having knowledge, having clear communication is really those 2 priorities in making that happen. And then just because no panel is complete without saying AI somewhere in it, I did find a study by the Nonprofit Quarterly that said by the end of 2025, they predict that AI-powered financial management systems will be standard in many nonprofits, and that will help reduce that administrative burden and improving transparency. So even if we're struggling right now, AI may help solve that in the future. But in the meantime, we can all find those 2 or 3 things that can help us just at least incrementally get that much closer to the ideal.
Thanks for sharing, Karen. All right, Marilyn, final thoughts on the future and how to get ahead today.
Yeah, I think that I would echo what Elizabeth was saying. I think that the demands for accountability are going to continue to increase, and they're probably, we need to expect that they may come from places we don't anticipate. I think that some of the conversations that have taken place by the Congress, calling presidents of private universities as well as public universities to hearings is an example of things that 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we really wouldn't have thought would likely happen, about how we make our investments and how we use our contributions. So I think one of the things I would suggest is that boards set aside time, whether it's part of a retreat that boards have on a regular basis, or it's a regular board meeting, just to have a conversation. Again, they may want to have outside experts be part of this, but to have a conversation to say, what are the limits that we're not compelled to go beyond in terms of accountability and transparency, and where are we willing to essentially take a stand if we are asked to cross that line. So I think the independence of boards in nonprofit organizations is extremely important. Understanding what that means in terms of transparency and accountability is important, and something that, at least in my career, we haven't spent much time talking about.
Thanks, Marilyn. All right, and with that, we have reached the end of our panel. I want to give a big thank you to our panelists for sharing their insights today. And I also want to give a big thank you to our audience. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed yourself and learned something that will benefit the work that you do on a daily basis. We have a packed few months of panels ahead of us, and I hope that you will join us for them. Keep an eye out on the Annex Unite community platform or in the Annex Unite LinkedIn page to make sure that you don't miss out on any of these. All right, that is it for me. It has been a pleasure speaking with you all. Thank you once again, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye, everyone. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.